Okay, let's get started. So I'm Lily, I'm your host. I'm very excited to be having this chat with you because we know these are very, very difficult studies to pull off, and it's going to be great to share solutions. Also, we'd love to hear your feedback. I'm going to share a little Typeform feedback survey. Please do let us know what your feedback is, because everything helps us and our team in order to build the next thing for you. To give you a bit of an outline of the session, we'll start by hearing from Becca Richards. She's one of our senior product managers at Prolific, and she's led on our latest release, which is running longitudinal studies on Prolific. The big intention behind this new feature is to help remove a lot of the painful legwork of running longitudinal studies online. And there's obviously a lot to running longitudinal studies online. So do consider this like our very first version. Raise any thoughts in the chat about how we can improve these features further. I'll share the link to the survey as well in the chat in a second. And yeah, everything you say is very valuable, so don't hold back. And then after you've heard from Becca, we're going to hear from Andrew Gordon, who's on our sciences team. He's going to present some research that he and our colleague Simon Jones conducted around what drives participant retention in online longitudinal studies. Is it money? Is it session length? We're going to find out. Very exciting. And hopefully you'll come away feeling like you've got some very actionable tips on what to do next time in terms of maximising that retention and setting up your study in the best way possible. And I'm now going to hand over to Becca.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Lily. Hi, everyone. It's so great to be with you today for my first Prolific webinar. As Lily mentioned, I'm Becca. I'm the Senior Product Manager for Prolific for Research. And I'm really excited to be speaking with you today about one of our latest releases, which is longitudinal studies. And I'm just going to be talking to you today about why we started building this in the first place, and also just giving you a demo of what it looks like in the product. So hopefully you can go and explore it yourself and have a play around, and I hope launch your longitudinal studies in a way that is sort of much easier and more intuitive. So let's get cracking. I'm just going to share my screen, so bear with me for 2 seconds while I do that. Okay, we'll get started. So longitudinal studies is, as I'm sure many of you are sort of like familiar with, it's a very powerful form of study design, but historically pulling it off online has been complex and very time consuming. And I'm sure many of you feel that pain. And up until now, running a longitudinal study on Prolific meant doing all of the coordination yourself. So a long-term diary study meant setting up multiple separate studies, creating these manually with allow lists, and having to sort of do all of the coordination between each wave by hand, perhaps tracking attrition in spreadsheets and, with the costs kind of calculated yourself before you even sort of knew what your sample target might look like. So from the actual study design itself to sourcing your panel, calculating your sort of like acceptable level of retention while balancing, budgets and all the way through to actually like managing your participants to ensure that all or most of them make it through from the start of your study to the end without churning. It takes up a lot of your time. And with our latest release, we've tried to sort of look at these sort of problem areas head on. So the latest release brings the recruitment of participants for longitudinal studies natively into the Prolific platform for the first time. And it sort of like tries to really hone in on the areas that will bring you sort of like the biggest friction points when you are setting up longitudinal studies yourself online. So this, can be kind of like split up into a few different sort of like main themes that we've touched on. So one of them is around managing the study setup with greater ease. So you set up your audience once and participants progress automatically. So there's no need to fiddle around with sort of participant groups or allow lists. The product will manage it for you. A little caveat just to say that, as Lily mentioned, this is our first launch and we're really, really keen for feedback. And there are just, a few areas that we'll be looking at improving on going forward. One of them is just that currently participants will need to take all waves within a longitudinal study rather than being able to skip waves at the moment. But that's something that we're looking into in terms of like adding more complex retention rules. The second area that we've built into the product is to show the study schedule that you've created through your waves to participants within their participant dashboard. And this is so that they know that they've got multiple studies coming up within this longitudinal project that they are committing to if they take on this project. And we see this as the other side of the coin of retention, is like what small tweaks and improvements can we make to the participant experience that keeps them sort of coming back to these to the waves and like sticking to your longitudinal studies and not churning. And the third area is the forecast for your retention. So we give a full picture of what your retention might look like if you set yourself with a certain retention rate. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail in the product. But this is just an easy way for you to kind of calculate straight off the bat how many participants you might need to reach your target completes. And when you do publish your study, within the platform, we allow you through our longitudinal new functionality to manage attrition in real time and take action to keep your study on track, such as adding new places to your study. And on Prolific, we've, even before this study went live, achieved sort of retention rates in the 80s and 90s. And this was just from sort of researchers running workarounds before this feature existed. So we have big plans for how we can sort of put control of your retention rate and easy management of sort of participants and communication with participants firmly in your hands with minimal work on your side. And later in this webinar, Andrew will talk about retention as well. So I will just switch my screen so I can move on to the demo, which is the exciting bit. Okay, fantastic. So I will now sort of take you through the full feature end to end. Okay. So when you first start to want to create your longitudinal study, you can do this in two ways. You can either go to the projects tab and create a project that is of a longitudinal nature from there, or you can do it from the create study tile. And you can just name this, and then you select from three options, and the longitudinal study is obviously the one that you would want to select. And from here, you'll see that the recruitment tab is pinned, and this is not movable, it's not deletable, because this is sort of like the first place where we expect you might want to start your sort of like setting up your longitudinal study. You can do this straight off the bat. You can add your screeners. You don't have to do it first. You can also add your waves, which I'll show in a minute. But to start with, if you wanted to, you can set up your screeners in whatever, combination you might want. These are just some very basic ones, just as an example. I'm sure this is very familiar, but we'll just start from the ground up. And from here, you can also set your device requirements, and then you just click save. I might just pause here really quickly just to say that the reason why we've done this is because obviously previously for a one-shot study, you would set your screeners up at the project level, in the study setup. But because this is obviously like a longitudinal study, you want your screeners to apply for the whole longitudinal sequence, not just per study, and you don't want to have to set those sort of eligibility requirements up for every single study. It would get messy. So that's why this has been moved to the project level. And then you can just see here that once you click save, you can go back in and edit if you want to. And then you can see that this step has been completed, marked as completed, and that you've had 2 screeners applied. So from here, you can add your study, which is your first wave. And this looks just very similar to the study setup that you might be used to. It has sort of like all of the fields that you might expect, apart from obviously one of the main differences being that the screener tab has been moved into its own sort of like pinned wave. The other thing that's different is that you'll see that you can't publish the study from this screen. You can preview it as a participant, or you can save it as a draft when you're happy with it. So you can just like save that here, and then you'll see that it's now ready to publish because you've obviously like set everything up. But I have actually just moved on to, for ease, a longitudinal project that I've already pre-filled, just so you don't have to watch me filling out multiple waves. But just to say that from here, you can add as many waves as you want. And again, you just go into the wave to set up the study. You can delete waves. So you can delete that there if you want to. And it's also just worth saying that once you publish your longitudinal project by publishing your first study, currently you aren't able to add any more waves or individual studies to that longitudinal project. So you just need to make sure that you've added all of the waves you might need before you publish the first wave. And this, like, you don't have to have all of the details set up for each wave. You can just save them as a very basic draft. Participants won't be able to kind of click into them and see that there's nothing there. They'll just see that there is a draft wave pending, and it will be given like a holding title if you haven't added one, essentially. I will, before we publish the study, like a study, I will just move on to the retention calculator just to talk about this. Actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to go into the project details tab just to say that because this is it's housed within a project, you will need to set up the project details, which is the parts of the project metadata that your participants will see when they first find your study within their dashboard. So you add like a title for your project, an overview, some additional information, and then your studies will appear here, and this is what they will see, and be able to, be aware of what the commitment is across the whole project. But now for the retention calculator. So essentially this is just a relatively simple calculator that lets you select your ideal retention rate. This isn't based on any sort of like particular data. It's not modeled in any way. It just means that you can set sort of like your desired rate, your target completions, and then we will just calculate for you how many participants you would need to recruit to be able to account for that retention drop off, and still make it to the number of like completions that you would want. So because the calculator has sort of said that to get to 10 or 10 completes with a 65% retention rate, I'd need 16 participants because I've just gone for a very small study as an example. So I'm just going to save this as a draft again in the first wave and then the second wave, because ideally all of my participants would complete. So I'm just saving that. And then when we publish the study, when we publish the study, it will change. So we'll just go through this whole flow. You can see just like a confirmation of the project details. I'm going to click next through all of this and publish this one wave. And then you can see that this has been moved to active, and this is now, it's been sent out to participants. And then you can see, now we can see the number of participants that we've sort of like estimated as the drop-off, the sort of like the cost of those participants and how many drop-offs we expect per wave. And you can still adjust the target retention at this point. And then you can also schedule the next study. So you might decide that you want your next wave to be available a week after the first wave, so you can schedule that in. And it just might show as publishing for a while. And then you can see this one has been scheduled. And then now that this wave, the first wave, has gone out to participants, you can kind of see through the color scheme like how your retention is tracking. If the color goes orange and you have like a shortfall, this means that you're maybe sort of slightly veering off track. And if it's green, it suggests that your retention is as expected. That is more or less the feature, but if you do have any questions or thoughts, do let me know. But as we've been talking about retention and calculating retention, I will hand over to Andrew.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, let me share my screen here. Hopefully you're all able to see that. Okay, perfect. Yeah, great to see you all. Thanks for coming to the webinar. My name's Andrew. I'm a staff researcher at Prolific, where I lead the research sciences team. So we're a kind of small team dedicated to running research that helps impact our product, but also our users. So we do a lot of kind of methodological work. And in this case, we are doing some work on longitudinal studies, specifically looking at how payment rate and the gap between the sessions that you release actually impacts how often participants come back for subsequent research. There's a QR code there that will take you to our preprint for this study, but it'll also be at the end, so don't feel like you need to read it now. I will also caveat, before I go through this, the results of this study in a little bit more detail, this was pre the product feature that Becca just showed you, so this actually isn't using Prolific's product feature. It's just a nice happenstance that we were doing research on this area, so we figured it would be good to share with you all today as well. So, I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit here, but why on earth do we even care about retention rate in online studies? Simple fact is that we all know when you run a longitudinal study, if it's online, offline, whatever it is, in person, people are going to drop out, right? So your starting sample size is never going to be the same as your finishing sample size. That has significant problems for a lot of researchers. You know, one of the major problems is statistical power, right? If you under-recruit at wave 1, by the time you get to wave 5, you may have way too few participants to power your analyses. That's obviously a big problem, so you need to know how many to recruit at wave 1. It also has a pretty big impact for your budget and your resources. So if you're over-recruiting at wave 1 and you end up with too many participants at your final wave, you've wasted a lot of money recruiting a lot of participants you didn't need. If you're under-recruiting at wave 1 and then you end up with too few participants at your final wave, you're going to waste a lot of time, because likely what you're going to have to do is run the entire sequence again just to top up those participants that you missed. So obviously that's a big impact on your resources as a researcher. Third, there are also kind of validity and generalizability concerns with attrition. Some demographics, some types of people may be more likely to attrite than others. Indeed, I'll show you some of the results from our study that show that that is indeed the case. This might be especially relevant when you're doing something like a representative sample within a longitudinal design. If you have maybe older participants and less likely to complete, then your end sample is not going to be representative, and it will be qualitatively different from that original sample that you got. Now, obviously, that has pretty significant effects for the validity and generalizability of any findings that you then take from that study. Finally, it's important just for evidence-based study design, right? There's very few there's very little practical guidance out there on the types of retention levels that you should expect. Most of it's just reported through studies that are doing longitudinal research rather than experimenting with it. 30 to 70% would be kind of the broad spectrum that we're looking at, but I've seen studies with a lot higher and I've seen studies with a lot lower. So when you're going to write grants, it's really important that you have some kind of benchmark that you can work with to justify how many participants you need in your study. So here we're looking at incentivization and we're looking at study intervals. So I thought it would be worth just kind of going through a little bit about what we know about how these impact retention before we jump into the study. And the very first thing to say is those are not the only things that impact retention, right? Like there are so many factors that can impact retention, demographics, personality, the quality of your experiences, all have been shown to impact retention. The reason we're focused on incentivization and intervals here is because those are the two things which are easiest for you as a researcher to modulate for your study. So we figured, we don't want a super complex study design. Let's focus on the two things that are most relevant for you as the researchers. Now, in terms of incentives, we do know that paying people is better than not paying people, which shouldn't come as a huge amount of a shock to you. But these papers from the early 2010s in clinical trials and population-based health contexts both showed that if you pay people, they come back. If you don't pay people, they tend not to, which fairly self-explanatory, but an interesting demonstration nonetheless. And we also know from some studies that higher value incentives tend to perform better than either low value incentives or contingent incentives. So contingent incentives, I mean, you don't pay anyone until they complete your entire study. Again, the problem here, though, is that this is also in clinical context and a population panel context. These aren't results that are actually being run on kind of the modern sampling ecosystems like Prolific and Veracyte and co. When you start to look at experimental work looking at predictors of retention, specifically within crowdsourced platforms, you actually find there's very, very little work out there. I pulled up some research on MTurk. So in 2021, there was the finding that higher initial compensation and escalating pay throughout the lifetime of the study leads to better retention. There was also some evidence from way back in 2013 that you get higher attrition if you pay less. The problem with this is, I mean, for anybody who does a lot of sampling across different contexts, we know that MTurk is a little bit of the Wild West, right? There are serious problems with some of the data from MTurk, and it means sometimes the effects that we see on MTurk simply don't replicate in other panels or other contexts. So when you look at higher quality panels, the only study I found that was really in this area was by Ritchie et al. In 2023, and they actually ran this study with us. They did a 2-wave study, and they paid participants either the standard rate or they paid them a significantly higher rate, and they found that if they paid a significantly higher rate, more participants came back. Now, the reason I say significantly higher rate is because I'm talking about a really significantly higher rate, right? I think they ended up paying people about 2 times the national minimum wage or something like that just to come back and get that retention bump. When we think about the intervals and gaps between studies, there's really basically no experimental evidence out there at all. So there's this ecological momentary assessment analysis, which shows that study frequency doesn't predict attrition. Obviously, that's very different to kind of your standard survey context. And there was this other finding that showed that interwave interval doesn't actually matter for the quality of the responses you get. So that's interesting, but it doesn't actually tell us anything about retention. So why do we need the study that we're talking about today? Well, first of all, there's just a lack of clarity, right? The literature at the moment don't converge on any recommendations that would actually kind of help you design a longitudinal study on a crowdsourced platform. As I mentioned as well, there's a lot of sample source confounds. So a lot of this work was done in kind of clinical health contexts, population health contexts, in person. Some studies done on crowdsourced platforms, but quite a while ago. All of these feature very different kind of researcher-participant relationships and norms. So that could feasibly impact the expected retention. Third, we just don't have any evidence at all on study spacing. And finally, while most research that I've shown you shows that paying people more tends to get people to come back more, the payment rates either seem to be way too high to be practical for most researchers, or they're done on some other sample and don't really relate to kind of modern sampling. So, what did we do? We set out with two pretty simple research questions. First of all, how do payment rate and session interval impact participant retention when we're doing a 5-wave longitudinal study? And second of all, is there anything about the participant that we can tell which actually is way more important for retention than just the way that you design your study? So we went out and we collected 1,800 participants on Prolific, US adults, and we split them between 9 different conditions, which was a full cross between payment rate and session interval. So payment rate, we had a low payment rate of £6 per hour, a moderate payment rate of £9 per hour, and a high payment rate of £9 per hour. Plus, if you complete all 5 sessions, you get a bonus session's worth of payment. For session interval, we kept it really straightforward. Short, medium, long, 1 week, 2 week, 4 weeks. That's the gap between when they received the study. And we set it up as what we just call a habit tracking study, right? So we asked participants questions about what their habits were like over the prior week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and what they think their habits will be like over the next few weeks as well. Just a 5-minute survey. It opened on a Monday, closed on a Friday. In terms of the kind of measures that we were looking at, first of all, on the retention side, we looked at full retention. So this is just a binary, did the participant complete all the sessions or not? We also looked at the session count, how many sessions on average did a participant complete? And then we wanted to also look at response speed. And the reason we did that is because certain longitudinal designs have a time-sensitive element to them, right? I've worked on designs where participants have to be taking a study in the morning and in the evening for multiple days in a row, right? In those cases, you really do care about how quickly your participants come back as well. So we wanted to see if the session interval and the payment rate actually impacted how quickly participants came back. So we looked at how long, on average, it took to get to 50% of session completions and how long it took to get to 90% of session completions. We also were quite interested in how spread out those completions might be. So we looked at something called coefficient of variation, which essentially measures, over the course of the week, were the sessions kind of randomly just split across the entire week, or did they all happen on the same day? That's the coefficient of variation measure. And then in terms of individual characteristics, we circled around a whole bunch of different things we could measure, but we eventually landed on 2 things. We landed on habits and experience. So on habits, we figured that this would be important because participants who have greater habitual tendencies probably more likely to stick around in longitudinal research. So the way we measured that was something called the Creature of Habit scale, which we gave to participants at every session they took part in. Great reliability across all sessions, which was really nice. And that measures 2 subscales of habit. So the first is routine. So participants who are high in that are very habitual participants. They like their routines. They plan a lot. And participants high in the other subscale, automaticity, are basically the exact opposite of that. They kind of fly through their life by the seat of their pants. They're very cue-driven. They're basically not habitual people at all. We also, in terms of participant experience, the best proxy that we could get for that was simply number of approved submissions on Prolific. So for every submission that they've taken on Prolific, how many of those were approved? And that was the other measure that we used. So, looking at some of the results, so this is just the descriptors around the number of sessions that a participant completed. So overall, the average was 4.25 out of 5 sessions, which was pretty good, across all conditions. Differences start to emerge when you look at the different conditions, right? So if you look at that right-hand column over there, that is the average number of sessions completed in the different interval conditions. And you can see that in the short interval conditions, so just 1 week between surveys, participants completed on average 4.6 of the sessions, whereas in the long interval condition, it went all the way down to 3.84. But when you look at the bottom row, which is the payment conditions, you can see it doesn't really vary that much, right? From about 4.2 to 4.31. So just on the face of it, when you look at session count, it does seem that something's happening with interval, but not really with pay. Then when we look at full retention, basically what you're looking at here, the graph on the left-hand side, that is cumulative retention across the 5 different waves. The different coloured lines are the different session intervals. So blue is short, orange is medium, pink is long. And then the different line types and dot types, those are the different payment rates. And the first thing that's pretty clear here, right, is all the different coloured lines are pretty well separated, but within those, the different types of lines, i.e. the different payment rates, are not that separated at all. What we actually found is that full retention rates for short interval condition was about 80% across the 5 waves, about 67% for the medium interval of 2 weeks, and all the way down to 50% for the long interval of 4 weeks. When we looked at payment rate, it was pretty similar. So 64% for the low payment rate, 65% for the standard payment rate, and 67% for the high payment rate, so not much differentiation. So then what we did is we ran a logistic regression. What we were trying to do there is predict the binary outcome, did the participant stay in the study or not, and we used all the predictors that I mentioned before. And what we found is that the gap between the studies significantly predicted how likely a participant was to stay in the study. So compared to the very short interval condition, participants in the medium interval condition were less likely to come back for the study, and then compared to the medium interval condition, participants in the long interval condition were less likely to come back from the study. But payment rate didn't impact it at all. So we saw no difference according to payment rate at all, and there's no interaction between those two either. Among the individual predictors, the experience and habit, what we found was that the strongest predictor by far was the number of approvals that a participant had got on submission. So we actually scaled that to a per 1,000 approvals, because we have a lot of participants who've taken a lot of studies. And what we found is that for each additional 1,000 approvals that a participant could have, they'd have a 23% higher chance of being retained across all 5 waves. Then on the habit side, we actually saw this pretty interesting pattern here. So we saw this kind of divergent nature of routine participants and automaticity participants, in that participants who were higher in the routine subscale were much more likely to be retained across all 5 waves. Participants higher in the automaticity scale were much less likely to be retained across all 5 waves. So it's pretty interesting, kind of shows the divergent nature of these 2 types of habit, and shows that habit really does play a role in longitudinal retention. Response speed, I'm going to kind of gloss over this, mainly because it's not that interesting, I don't think. When we look at time to 50% of completion, time to 90% of completion, what we find is that the short interval conditions, typically participants came back a lot quicker than in the long interval conditions, but the medium interval condition didn't differ at all. Similar pattern was seen for coefficient of variation, so participants in the short interval condition, strangely enough, had more varied completion times than participants in the medium and long condition. But for all of these measures, once again, we see no impact at all of payment rate. So it didn't matter what you paid participants, it didn't make them come back to your study any quicker. Finally, we're looking at response speed at the individual level. So basically what we did was we calculated each participant's mean response time across all sessions, and we analysed it using exactly the same set of predictors as we did before. We're simply trying to predict their individual response time now. And what we find when we look at it at this individual level is that neither session interval nor payment rate actually predicted how quick a participant would be to complete a study. But, once again, prior experience by approvals on Prolific was an extremely strong predictor. So the more sessions that you've done for Prolific in the past, the more likely you were to respond very quickly to a study that got posted. With the habit subscales, I'm not going to read too much into this because they are in that annoying state of trending towards significance but not quite getting there. But directionally, pretty similar to what we saw with the retention analysis, in that participants higher in routine were slightly more likely to come back quickly than participants in the automaticity subscale, who were more likely to come back slowly. So what does this actually tell us about, how these things impact retention? Well, first of all, it shows that moderate payment differences don't improve retention in online longitudinal studies. Across every analysis we did, there was just no impact of payment rate at all that we could find. Obviously, this is pretty different to that study I mentioned earlier, Ritchie et al., where they found this big bump in retention with higher payment. I think the reasons for that are probably twofold. First of all, they're looking at a 2-session study. We're looking at a 5-session study. The dynamics of attrition differ quite massively as you add more studies to design. Second of all, the payment rate for their study was, as I mentioned earlier, significantly higher than the payment rate for our study. Our findings, though, are very consistent with this idea that in very well-established online panels, like Prolific, like Cloud Research Connect, like these kind of proprietary panels, payment effect might just be reduced, right? Because participants have a lot of studies to choose from. They're probably not paying, they might not be paying too much heed to the payment rate that we're offering them. Second thing we find is that session interval is a critical lever, so shorter study intervals substantially increase participation speed and the likelihood of full retention across all 5 waves. This stands in pretty stark contrast to a lot of people get very concerned with this idea of burnout from participants, that if you contact a participant too much, you're just going to fatigue them and they're not going to come back. This says exactly the opposite, right? If you want a participant to come back, contact them more often and they will come back. Finally, we show this role of habit and experience, these individual characteristics. So we show that automaticity and routine have divergent roles, and that habit is related. Habitual constructs are related to retention in online longitudinal studies. We also show that participant experience is by far the strongest predictor of retention that we measured. And the important thing here, and I think this is a really critical thing that I'd love people to take away, it opens up this question of whether retention in a longitudinal study is really a psychologically neutral process or not, right? We're showing here, granted we only have 2 measures here, but we are showing that within this, the starting group of participants and the final group of participants did differ by some constructs, right? They differed in their habits, they differed in their experience. So if you're running a longitudinal study, this is the kind of thing you need to think about at the design stage. You need to be thinking about, what are the participant traits, characteristics and things like that could conceivably be related to what I'm studying, and you should probably measure them throughout the life cycle of the study to make sure that whoever you're starting with is relatively similar to the group that you're ending with. And also be aware that you may end up with participants who are slightly more experienced in online studies than the participants at the start. Worth pointing out a few key limitations before we wrap up. First of all, I put in the previous slide moderate pay differences. It is entirely possible that our payment differences weren't sufficiently differentiated, right? £6 per hour versus £9 per hour versus £9 per hour plus a bonus. When you factor that down to the level of a 5-minute study, the actual cost that a participant sees on their dashboard, it isn't that high, and the differentiation isn't that big. If we had paid, significantly higher than that, we might have seen that same bump that Richie et al. Did. Related to that, we didn't test a high payment condition that wasn't bonus contingent, right? There could have been a condition where we just pay them £12 per hour without a bonus. That would also be informative, and it is something we want to run next. Second of all, results on any provider don't necessarily generalize to every single provider you could possibly get, right? There are different dynamics that operate on different providers. If you go to a Cint or a Qualtrics panel of this world, they have a totally different researcher participant model. We don't know whether this will actually generalize to those other platforms as well. Third, like I mentioned earlier, there's a bunch of retention levers we just didn't test here, right? Like we have pretty strong anecdotal evidence from our consulting team, our managed services team, that reminders and increasing the bonus throughout the course of the study are super effective. This is something we want to move on and test next, but it's worth remembering that those other levers could be extremely important as well. And finally, and most importantly, right, we see these huge impacts of session interval in our design, but session interval isn't necessarily malleable, right? Like you may have a specific design in mind that requires a certain session interval, and you can't just shorten that arbitrarily. So the problem then becomes that the optimal spacing for good retention doesn't necessarily fit with the optimal spacing for whatever phenomenon you are looking at. I guess our advice here would be, if you can shorten that gap between studies, you should. And that's pretty much it. I think hopefully we've got some time for questions. I'm putting the QR code up there again if you want to read the paper, and please feel free to reach out to myself or Simon Jones, who is my co-author on this, with any questions you might have.